today I'm going to show you how I paint a rose in gouache, or at least one way to paint a rose in gouache. Roses are a tricky flower to paint, yet they're really popular and they're worth taking on as a challenge because it allows you to, the skills you learn when painting a rose allow you to paint all sorts of different flowers. So today I am painting on a piece of Arches watercolor paper. I took a big sheet and I cut it down so it's a little bit more affordable. You can also do this in some sort of multimedia sketchbook. I've done a lot of gouache paintings in those sorts of sketchbooks in the past, or sometimes like a watercolor sketchbook or some other type of watercolor paper. I have squared off an area of the paper using washi tape, and I am using 4 different paintbrushes. I might end up only using 3 of them, so these 2 will probably be the main ones that I use. I have a 16 Princeton Heritage Round, which is this big red one, and then I have an 8, which is also a round, and I'm not sure what brand this is. It says, I think, HJ. I'm not sure it was a gift, but it works pretty well. And then this one is a 6, which I may use. It's a bit smaller, so I might not use it because I don't want it to be too picky on the details. And then this little guy is a 0 Princeton Glacier Round, and I'll probably just use that for signing my name. Gouache, you can use generally just any watercolor brushes, but if you're using the acrylic-based gouache, don't use your good watercolor brushes. I'm using non-acrylic gouache, so it's more of the traditional gouache, so it'll re-wet even after it's dry. And I am using 4 Winsor Newton colors. So I have primary red, primary blue, primary yellow, and you don't need a green, but permanent green middle I'll be using a little bit too. And I'm using this is an M. Graham & Company titanium white. And that's just because that's what the store had on sale that day when I was shopping. And then I just have a couple jars of clean water and a palette. So I will get some paint out onto the palette. This is a pretty new tube, so it's a little bit separated, but that's okay. Okay, let's get painting. So wet your brush, and you can use a paper towel. I use an old tea towel, white flour sack tea towel, to dab off the water on my brush. And let's just start by taking some of the red, adding some water so that it flows nicely. And then let's just paint essentially the silhouette shape of the rose. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but I want a petal that's going to go up there, petal that touches there, and then petal that comes down kind of into this corner that has a little bit of a notch. And this is just the first layer, so if you're finding it's not hugely or is not as opaque as you would like it to be, that's okay, because this is just the start of the rose. Okay, let's clean the red off. Red, of course, takes a little bit to clean out of your brush. And let's do our first layer of the background. So I don't want to go quite this intense of a green, so I'm just going to take some of this green, a little bit of blue, and this I'm just going to play around with, a little yellow, a little more blue. Now the opposite side of the color wheel from green is red, so if you have a little bit of red, it dulls down the color a little, so it's not quite so intense. Now I find this too dark for an initial layer, so I'm going to grab a little bit of the white and add that in, and then just add it as the back layer, or the first layer of the background. If you find the gouache isn't flowing as nicely as you would like, just add a little bit more water. And just kind of go around, again, not being too worried about accidentally going over top of your rose, because you'll be adding more layers. Now remember, as you're going through this whole painting, gouache dries darker. There's a color shift, so it dries darker than your initial color. Now this looks pretty intense, but don't worry about it, because we'll be adding more layers and bringing down some of the intensity and changing the shades a little. Now I'm just going to wait until this dries a little bit more. Okay, it's not 100% dry, but it's a little bit drier than it was before, so I'm just going to wet my brush again. Now what I would like to do is to get some more dark reds in there. So I'm going to take some of my red gouache, I'm going to put it into this mixing well, and I'm going to take some of this green that kind of got into the red and just make a darker red. Now remember what I had said earlier about red and green being on the opposite side of the color wheel, so adding a bit of the colors from opposite sides may bring down the intensity, so it can get you some nice darks. So now I'm just going to add in some dark areas where I expect there to be a darker area on the petal. So areas where light wouldn't get in quite so much. So just adding some in. And I want to paint this quite loosely. I don't want this to be too picky of a painting, too detailed. I just want, you know, the impression of a rose. So I'll just add a few more spots, and we'll be doing a few layers. So if you're not happy with this, don't worry about it quite yet, because you'll play around with it. There's also the challenge of going, okay, this isn't detailed, but it's right. You know, I always find it's hard to say, okay, this is great. When I feel like something more detailed, I can just keep adding detail and make it better, but I don't actually want that a lot of times. Okay, so we have that middle tone, or that darker tone, added in. Now let's start adding some lighter tones. So again, we'll get some more red. Add it to one of these wells, and I accidentally pushed it into the white, which is fine because I was going to make a lighter color anyway. So again, make sure you're adding just a bit of water to your gouache so that it flows nicely, and just depending on the brand of gouache, the age of gouache, you can it really varies of how it comes out of the tube and whether you feel like you need to add a lot of water or not. So here I'm adding kind of this kind of lighter tone. It's not light, but lighter in areas where you'd be getting some light. I'm using my larger brush because I want this to be quite loose. I don't want to have too many areas with just, you know, small amounts of, too many areas with picky details. So that's why I'm using a size 16 round. Okay, I cleaned off my brush, And I'm going to, I kind of want to go back to kind of that middle tone, almost like the original color. Just add a bit more of a transition. Now with transitions, you can kind of go in between, you know, the darker area and the lighter area and just add a stroke of paint or a couple strokes of paint, but not too much. Just want to make sure that we have enough of that middle tone in there. Okay, now let's go back to a lighter tone. So a little bit of water on the brush. We'll add a bit more white to the kind of middle light tone that we had already put on. And I'll add that in places where the petals might be getting some sunlight. The middle is always a little bit tricky, I find, just because it can get pretty tightly packed. Sometimes doing kind of like a little bit of a, you see I did a little bit of a C-ish shape, and then I'm just going to add another C going that way, but not a perfect C, so kind of like dabs of C's. The letter C, I mean. Now remember, as this dries, it'll dry a bit darker. Gonna get a little bit darker red. Just gonna add that in a few places. And this is where the playing happens, where you go kind of like the back and forth. And really what I'm aiming for is this look of different layers of petals kind of folding around each other. Okay, now let's go even lighter. Add a little bit of water just to get that flow. Just keep adding little dabs. And even more white. Add just a little bit, because sometimes the center has the biggest contrast of colors, with the dark, where the tightly packed petals don't allow much light to get in, and then the light, the brightest brights. Okay. Just going to go back and forth a little bit with kind of a lighter middle tone. Just to make sure I have enough lights. Okay, now let's leave that as it is. Clean off my brush. Now let's spend a little bit of time on the greens. Now we have this fairly dark green background that is contrasting pretty dramatically with the red, and that's because two colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel, especially if they're similar vibrancies, will kind of compete with each other. So what I'm going to do is I wet my brush. I'm going to take a fair amount of the yellow and add it to the green that I had mixed earlier. And just a little bit more yellow, just to make more of brighter green. Now, this is something I do with the largest brush because I don't want to have many details. So I'm just going to add large brush strokes. And again with this, we're going to go back in with some other layers of colors and adjust. So you can leave a little bit of that other color completely showing through. Oops, got past my tape there, that's okay. You can leave a little bit of that green showing through, but it will also, even though gouache is somewhat opaque, it'll still kind of peek through the actual paint that you've put down. Now I've added a bit more yellow. Now, if I'm thinking about kind of a typical rose bush, the leaves that are underneath the rose itself are going to be a bit darker because they're going to be in shadow. So I'm going to I added a bit more yellow, which brings up the value of the green. And I'm just going to add some kind of very blurry shapes. And now I'm going to take a bit of white and add it to just what was left on my brush. And I'm just going to add a bit here and there. And I don't love the look right there, so I'm just going to, it's just a little too dramatic. Okay. Now I clean my brush. I'm going to let that dry, not necessarily 100% dry, but let it dry a bit more, and then we'll finish this off. Okay, we're mostly dry again. So we're going to put the last layer on. Now at this point, I want you to take a look at what you have and decide, does the shape make sense? Is there anything that needs to be adjusted? So for me, the big thing that I'm noticing is I have it looks like one giant petal that goes all the way around, which of course is not very natural. So I'm going to adjust that. So get a bit of water on my brush. And you might find that your gouache is getting a bit dry. And as long as you have the traditional gouache, that's okay, because it'll just re-wet. So I'm just going to make quite a dark color, so even darker than what I had added before. And I'm going to add that in a few places. Just add a little bit of extra. I'm probably going to end up layering over a lot of the painting, so not necessarily covering everything up completely, but kind of getting into doing a lot of layering in this last step. So depending how happy you are with yours so far, you might end up just putting, some light layering on. I'll probably do quite a bit of layering. Okay, so we added some quite dark colors. Let's go back to kind of a middle-ish color and add a little bit in. Now what I want to do is make sure that I have some spots that look like I'm breaking up these petals. So I cut through there. I'll probably cut through a little bit there, not fully. And then here, I want to kind of make it look like it's a separate petal. Okay, it looks a little bit drawn in right now. That's okay, we will adjust that with some more layers. I'm gonna grab a little bit more red because I made a little bit of a mess with what I have on my palette. I don't want to go too light quite yet. Okay, so adding some water so that this gouache flows nicely. Just adding it here with a little bit of the darker, but also a little bit of the light. So I'm adding white and I'm adding some of the red that was mixed with the green so that it's less saturated or less intense, but not super dark. color. I'm just going to add some layers in. Bring down kind of the intensity of that dark that I'd added before. So I want a bit of that dark in there, but maybe not quite so intense. Okay, so I'm just going to get a bit more of the lighter. As you can see on my palette here, it's actually a little bit grayed out compared to what it was before, and that's because I've just used some of that because of the green that was in there from what I had mixed earlier. So again, even though I'm going lighter, it's not necessarily a brighter color. So just adding some layers. Kind of dabbing them on, just doing a little, you just do like a stroke of the brush and then lift up. You don't want to like smear as much as you're playing around with it. You don't really want to smear it because then you get kind of an overly blended look sometimes. Okay, so making it lighter, adding some more in. Making sure that I don't bring back that overly curved C. And let's add a bit more white. And add that in. Now with the white, I'm using more of the tip of my brush rather than the kind of broader side of my brush, which was what I was using earlier. That's because the part of the petals that the light would be glinting off of would be a lot smaller than kind of the broader areas of light you would find, or broader areas of color on the petal, just where I was putting in the medium colors or mid-tone colors. Just making it a little bit lighter and adding a bit more. Now remember, again, with gouache, it'll dry darker, so probably kind of let it sit. I'm going to leave that be for now, and I'm actually just going to put a bit more of a layer onto the green because I find it still quite bright. I want the rose to be more of the feature of this than the background. So I'm going to take some of that red. Now this can be a little bit scary, so it might take you a few tries to kind of get the colors you want. Because right now that's too orangey, so I'm going to add some more red back in, or sorry, green back into that. Because what I would really like is a toned down green. Add some yellow so that it's not quite so dark. So you can already see this is far less of an intense green than anything that I had layered down before. I don't want it to be quite that dark, so just add a little bit of white. Okay, now let's add this in. It's probably a little too dark still. I'm going to add a bit more white. Okay, so now let's put this in. And again, this darker color I'm going to put kind of down where you would expect more shadows. Now I'm going to add some more white, and it was kind of a pinky white. And that's okay as long as you're not getting too far onto a red color. Add a bit of yellow just to also lighten up the value. As long as you're not turning your green into a red, it'll probably turn kind of orangey before it turns red. You can add a bit of red to your greens to bring down the intensity. Okay, so that's not quite as bright as it was. It's okay though if I leave a little bit peeking through from the background, because that's Just adds a little bit of energy to the painting. Add a bit more white. I don't have much white left. See if I could just add yellow to bring up the value. It's one of the tricks that you can do when color mixing is sometimes you don't want to get too pastel-y of a color, which is what can happen when adding white. So you can add yellow because yellow tends to be quite a pale value. So you can add some yellow and see how that affects. So you can see this is much more of an olivey color than it was before. Now, I don't want it to be, you know, light, medium, dark, so I'm just adding a little bit of the lighter color into the midtones. I'm going to go into some of this brighter color that I had mixed before. Add a bit more yellow as well. I'm just going to add that in here. Just to give a bit of a different, few different shades. Okay, clean off my brush. And I've let, as I was doing that, the rose would have dried a little bit more. So I'm going to take size 8, just because it's a bit of a smaller brush. Let's just put a bit more of the white out because I've really made a mess of my white. So just a little bit, because we're not going to need a whole lot. So wet brush, some white, a little bit of this pale color. Just gonna add a bit more just of the brightest white. Don't be too perfect with it. It can be a little bit broken because a rose that's growing, so this is a photo, came from a photo of a rose that I had grown in my garden. You're not going to get, you know, perfect petals with a garden rose. So you don't necessarily want to have a perfect curve with any of this. Okay. There we go. Now you can do your signature. Let's see, let's mix what a nice dark purpley blue. So that has a bit of green in it, but we'll add some purple. Get that nice and dark. You want to make sure that you have just the right amount of water and paint so that it flows nicely. To put your name. See how this goes. It's still a little bit wet in the background, so we'll just do our best. Always go back and fix it later if you have to. Just keep adding a bit more paint when you need to. Yeah, this green's a little bit wet still, so it's not wanting to take my signature, but that's okay. I can adjust it a little bit more later if I want. And now get to peel off, which is always the nice part. It's a little, I went over the edge of the tape, which is okay. You can always go over that with a little bit of plain white gouache if you accidentally do that. You can also clean up anywhere, like there's tiny little spots with where it went under the tape. But other than that, that is a quick little rose painting in gouache.